Everyone, this is my husband, Alex.
Ah,
It's a pleasure to meet you all.
I always believed love was simple. You stay, I told Emily once, and I stay. She laughed and said, "That's marriage." I believed her because loyalty made sense to me, and promises felt heavy enough to hold people in place. When I met her, she said, "You look like someone who listens." I replied, "I do." That was the start. We talked, we married, and I trusted without counting the cost. At the gathering, Daniel slapped my back and said, "Relax, man, you look like you're on trial." I said, "I just don't like crowds." He grinned. "You like her, though." I nodded. "I love her." He raised his cup. "Then you're already winning." Emily stood near me, phone in hand. Sarah leaned toward her and whispered, "You okay?" Emily smiled too fast and said, "I'm fine." I noticed the phone vibrate. She turned it face down. I told myself not to notice. Someone asked, "So how do you two know each other?" Emily squeezed my arm and said, "This is my husband." The word hit me like warmth spreading through my chest. Husband. I smiled and said, "Nice to meet everyone." Daniel laughed. "See? Told you." I pulled Emily aside and whispered, "You didn't have to say it like that." She looked at me and said, "Why not?" I said, "It just meant a lot." She kissed my cheek and replied, "Good." Her smile shook for a second, then settled. Sarah said, "Emily, come take a picture." Emily said, "In a minute." Her phone buzzed again. I asked, "Everything okay?" She said, "Work stuff." I said, "On a weekend?" She said, "It never stops." I said, "We can leave early." She shook her head. "No, stay." Daniel leaned in and joked, "You two are gross." Emily laughed. "Jealous?" He said, "Always." The laughter felt real. I held onto it. Later, I said, "Do you remember when we met?" Emily said, "You ordered tea at a bar." I said, "You said I was strange." She said, "I said you were honest." I asked, "Am I still?" She hesitated and said, "Yes." The pause pricked me, but I ignored it. Sarah asked me, "You happy?" I said, "I am." She looked away and said, "Good." I didn't understand why that felt wrong. Emily checked her phone again. I said, "Who is it?" She said, "No one." I said, "You're sure?" She said, "Please don't start." I replied, "I'm not starting anything." She nodded, distant. "Okay." A stranger said, "You're lucky." I said, "I know." Emily smiled at them, then stepped away to take a call. I watched her back and felt proud instead of afraid. When she returned, she said, "I'm sorry." I asked, "For what?" She said, "Nothing." I said, "You don't have to apologize." She said, "I know." As we left, Daniel said, "Good night, husband." I laughed and said, "Good night." Emily took my hand. I thought that name meant safety. I thought it meant forever. I went home believing I was chosen, not knowing this was the moment I would remember when everything broke. In the car, I said, "Did you have fun?" She said, "Yes." I asked, "You sound tired." She replied, "Long week." I said, "We can order food." She said, "I'm not hungry." I joked, "Since when?" She smiled thinly. "Since now." I said, "Talk to me." She said, "I am." I said, "It doesn't feel like it." She looked out the window and said, "Can we just listen to music?" I said, "Sure." At a red light, her phone buzzed again. I said, "You don't have to hide it." She said, "I'm not hiding." I said, "Then answer." She said, "Later." I said, "Okay." The light turned green. At home, Daniel texted, "Proud of you." I showed Emily. Sarah messaged, "Get home safe." Emily typed back fast, then stopped. I said, "What did she say?" Emily said, "Nothing important." I said, everything feels important tonight. You're dramatic. I said, only because I care. She kissed me and said, I know. I fell asleep thinking the word husband had anchored us. I felt safe. I felt chosen. I didn't know safety could vanish overnight. I woke up reaching for Emily and touched cold sheets. I said, Emily. No answer. I checked my phone. One unread message from her at 3:12 a.m. It said, I need space. I typed, where are you? No reply. I laughed and said out loud, this is a misunderstanding. I called her. Straight to voicemail. I said, hey, call me back. I waited 5 minutes. I called again. Nothing. I texted, did I do something? Then, please answer. Then, I'm worried. The silence pressed against my chest. I walked into the kitchen and said, you forgot your mug. My voice echoed. I checked the closet. Half her clothes were gone. I said, okay, calm down. I opened her drawer. It was empty. I sat on the bed and whispered, this isn't funny. By noon, I called Daniel. She left, I said. He replied, left how? I said, she's not here. He said, maybe she's with Sarah. I said, she'd tell me. He paused. Give her time. I said, time for what? He said, marriage stuff. I hung up angry. I replayed last night. Did I push you? I had asked. She said, no. I said, are you sure? She said, stop. I remembered her tone. Sharp. Closed. I told myself I missed something. I always missed something. I texted Sarah. Have you heard from Emily? No reply. An hour later, I sent, please. Still nothing. I said to the wall, you're her best friend. The wall didn't answer either. By evening, I called Daniel again. She's not answering, I said. He said, come over. I said, I can't leave. He asked, why? I said, what if she comes back? He sighed. Man, listen to yourself. I said, I am. I sat on the couch and spoke to the empty room. I love you. I waited. We can fix this. Silence. I checked her side table. Her ring box was gone. My throat burned. I said, that means nothing. I didn't believe it. The second night, I slept with the lights on. I woke to every sound. Each buzz made my heart jump. None were her. I whispered, just come home. My phone stayed dark. On day 3, Sarah finally replied. I can't talk. I typed, why? She didn't answer. I threw my phone on the bed and shouted, why won't anyone talk to me? My voice cracked. I covered my face and breathed through shaking hands. Daniel showed up unannounced. He said, you look bad. I said, she left me. He said, I know. I asked, know what? He said, that she left. I stared at him. You talked to her. He looked away. Not really. I said, don't lie. He said, she needs space. I said, that's not an answer. He didn't argue. After he left, I noticed her toothbrush gone. Her shampoo missing. Her coat wasn't on the hook. I slid down the wall and said, this wasn't a fight. I laughed weakly. This was planned. I opened our message history and scrolled. Love you. Be home soon. Sleep well. My fingers shook. I typed, please tell me what's happening. The message stayed unread. I finally said it out loud. She's not coming back. The words tasted wrong. I pressed my palms together and whispered, I was abandoned. The house answered with silence, and that silence felt final. I went to Sarah's place and said, you can't ignore me anymore. She said, I told you I can't talk. I said, you can, and you will. She opened the door wider and whispered, lower your voice. I said, I've been quiet for days. She said, come in. I stepped inside and said, where is she? She rubbed her hands and said, I didn't want to be the one. I replied, You already are. I said, Is Emily safe? Sarah nodded. Yes. I said, Is she hurt? Sarah shook her head. No, I said. Then what is this? She sat down and said, You should sit. I stayed standing. Just tell me. She swallowed and said, She's pregnant. I said, We are married. Sarah whispered, I know. I said, So why are you crying? She said, Because it's not yours. The room went quiet. I said, Say that again. She said, The baby isn't yours. I waited for anger, but nothing came. I asked, Whose is it? Sarah looked at the floor. Ryan's. I laughed once and said, Her coworker. Sarah nodded. I said, The one she said was annoying. Sarah said, Yes. I said, The one she told me not to worry about. Sarah didn't answer. My thoughts scattered. I remembered Emily saying, He's just a friend. I remembered her phone lighting up at night. I remembered saying, Do you want kids someday? And her replying, Not now. I said, How long? Sarah whispered, Months. I said, While we were together. She said, Yes. I nodded slowly. So I kissed her goodnight while she carried his child. Sarah covered her mouth. I asked, Did everyone know? Sarah said, No, I said, You did. She said, I begged her to tell you. I said, And she ran. Sarah cried. She was scared. I replied, Of me. Sarah said, Of the truth. I said, The truth is I trusted her. My voice sounded distant to me. I sat down and said, Does she love him? Sarah hesitated. I don't know. I said, Did she ever love me? Sarah said, Yes. I asked, Then why him? Sarah said, She felt wanted. I smiled faintly. I wanted her every day. Sarah said, I know. I said, Was I not enough? Sarah reached for me. I pulled away. I stared at the wall and said, I was her husband. Sarah whispered, You still are. I shook my head. No, I said. Husbands aren't replaced. Sarah said, She didn't plan this. I said, She planned the lies. Sarah said, She panicked. I replied, She chose. I stood up and asked, Is she keeping it? Sarah nodded. I said, With him. Sarah said, For now. I said, Does he know? Sarah said, Yes. I laughed softly. So I'm the last one who knew. Sarah said, I'm sorry. I said, Sorry doesn't fix this. On the walk home, I spoke to myself. You missed every sign. I remembered Emily saying, You're too good. I thought it was love. I wondered if I was blind or just disposable. I asked myself, was any of it real? The answer didn't come. At home, I looked in the mirror and said, You were faithful. My reflection didn't respond. I whispered, You were honest. Silence answered. I sat on the bed and asked, Was I ever enough? I didn't cry. I felt hollow. I realized my marriage wasn't ending. It had already ended without me. I stopped answering my phone. When it rang, I stared and said, I can't. When Daniel texted, I read it and didn't reply. When Sarah called, I let it buzz until silence returned. I told myself quiet was safer than people. Days blurred. I ate when I remembered. I spoke to no one except the walls. You trusted her, I said. That doesn't make you weak. The walls didn't argue. Mark found me at work. He said, You look like hell. I said, I'm fine. He said, You're lying. I shrugged. He said, Sit. I said, I don't want advice. He replied, Good, because I'm giving facts. We Saturday. He said, She cheated. I said, I know. He said, She lied. I said, I know. He leaned forward. Then why are you punishing yourself? I said, because I missed it. He said, you trusted your wife. I said, that was stupid. He snapped, no, it was normal. I said, she chose him. Mark said, and that's on her. I said, I wasn't enough. He laughed once. Stop. I stared. He continued, you don't lose value because someone else lacks loyalty. I said, easy for you to say. He replied, I lost everything once. I asked, did you blame yourself? He said, until I learned better. I avoided my apartment after that. I walked instead. I said to myself, don't break. I repeated it like a rule. At night, I almost texted Emily. I typed, why? I erased it. I typed, please. I erased that too. I said, no answers will save you. Mark called. Did you eat? I said, I don't know. He said, you're not allowed to disappear. I said, I want to. He said, that's not survival. I sighed. What is? He said, getting up anyway. At work, he watched me and said, you're quiet. I said, I'm thinking. He said, about revenge. I said, no, he nodded. Good. I asked, why? He said, revenge keeps you tied to her. I said, I don't forgive her. He replied, you don't have to. One night, Daniel knocked. I didn't open the door. He said, I'm worried. I said through the wood, go home. He said, talk to me. I said, there's nothing left to say. He paused. You're not alone. I answered, I am right now. He left quietly. I sat on the floor and said, you loved honestly. I waited. That wasn't wrong. My chest tightened, then eased. I said, her betrayal doesn't define you. Saying it hurt, but it steadied me. The next morning, I showered, dressed, and showed up. Mark saw me and said, there you are. I said, I'm still standing. He replied, that's enough for today. I stopped asking why she left. I stopped imagining her regret. I said, closure isn't coming. I felt lighter admitting it. I didn't forgive Emily. I didn't hate her either. I chose something else. I said to my reflection, you will rebuild quietly. The mirror stayed silent. I added, no begging, no chasing. I breathed out and said, just survival. I stayed off social media. I said, I don't need to see her smile. When my phone buzzed, I flipped it over and said, not today. Mark texted, walk. I replied, fine. We walked in silence until he said, talk. I said, I'm tired. He said, good. Tired means you're alive. I asked him, do you ever stop thinking about it? He said, not completely. I said, then how do you live? He said, you live anyway. I nodded. That sounds stupid. He smiled. It works. That night, I boxed her letters. I said, these don't own me. I didn't read them. I sealed the box and said, enough. My hand shook, but I didn't stop. I opened my laptop and wrote a list. I said each line out loud. Work. Sleep. Eat. Breathe. I laughed and said, basic survival. It felt right. I made one promise. I won't chase her. I made another. I won't explain myself. I said, if she regrets it, that's hers. The words settled. Before bed, I said, you can survive this. I didn't believe it fully, but I said it anyway. I turned off the light and added, tomorrow, you start rebuilding. I lay awake and said, no revenge. I repeated it. No forgiveness yet. That felt honest. I said, just forward. My chest hurt, but it didn't collapse. I imagined a future without explanations and felt calmer. I whispered, I choose me. The decision didn't feel brave. It felt necessary. When sleep came, I let it. I wasn't healed. I was surviving, and that was enough for now. I promised myself silence would become strength, and strength would build a life no one could ever abandon again, starting tomorrow morning alone. Time passed without announcing itself. One morning I said, "You're still here," and meant it. At work, Mark looked at me and said, "You're different." I said, "I'm quieter." He replied, "You're steadier." I accepted that. I focused on simple things. Finish this report. Go to the gym. Sleep. When my body hurt, I said, "Good." Pain meant movement. Daniel asked, "You okay?" I answered, "I'm functional." He said, "That's not nothing." I agreed. At the gym, a woman said, "You're using that bench." I said, "Go ahead." She smiled. "Thanks." Later she said, "I'm Lena." I said, then stopped. "I'm me." She laughed softly. "That's enough." We talked between sets. She said, "You come here often." I said, "Recently." She asked, "Why recently?" I said, "Life." She nodded. "That's a big reason." She didn't ask more. I noticed that. After a week, she said, "Coffee." I said, "Just coffee." She said, "Just coffee." "Over cups," she said. "You're careful with words." I said, "I learned to be." She said, "From someone." I said, "From myself." She accepted it. At work, whispers reached me. Someone said, "Did you hear about Emily?" I said, "No," they said, "Ryan's struggling." I said, "I'm busy." The words didn't sting like before. They felt distant, like news from another city. Lena asked, "You ever married?" I paused and said, "Once." She said, "That's a full stop." I said, "Yes." She didn't pity me. She said, "You survived." I replied, "I'm surviving." She smiled. "That's honest." I started trusting my instincts again. When my phone buzzed with unknown numbers, I didn't jump. I said, "If it matters, it will wait." Mark noticed and said, "You're not flinching anymore." I said, "I learned flinching doesn't help." Daniel told me, "Sarah said Emily's not doing well." I said, "I'm not asking." He said, "You're cold." I replied, "I'm calm." He considered that. "That's better." Lena said, "You don't talk about your past." I said, "I don't need to." She said, "That's fair." One evening she added, "I'm not here to fix you." I said, "Good." She said, "I'm here to know you." I nodded. "That I can do." At the gym, she said, "You smile more." I said, "I breathe easier." She said, "What changed?" I said, "I stopped arguing with reality." She smiled. "That's growth." Rumors kept circling. Ryan moved out. Money problems. Fights. I didn't lean in. I said, "Not my story." Each time I said it, it felt truer. I caught my reflection and said, "You look stronger." I meant my eyes. I asked myself, "Do you still hurt?" I answered, "Yes." I asked, "Does it control you?" I said, "No." That surprised me. Lena asked, "Dinner?" I said, "As friends." She replied, "As humans." Over food, she said, "You choose yourself now." I said, "I learned I have to." She said, "Good choice." Daniel asked, "Do you miss her?" I said, "I miss who I thought I was with her." He nodded. "That's different." I agreed. Very. At work, Mark said, "You're leading this project." I said, "I can handle it." He smiled. "I know." Responsibility felt right. I wasn't fragile. I was focused. Lena said, "You're not broken." I said, "I know." Saying it felt like closing a door gently. She asked, "What do you want?" I answered, "Peace." She said, "You're getting there." One night, I heard another update. "Emily asked about you." I said, "I'm unavailable." The words felt final without cruelty. I realized something simple. I'm not defined by betrayal. I said it out loud. It stayed. I added, I'm defined by what I built after. The thought settled into my bones. Before sleep, I told myself, you're enough. I didn't argue. I wasn't healed completely, but I was whole enough to keep going. I turned off the light and thought, this is the man I became without her, and for the first time, I liked him. I heard it without asking. Daniel said, you didn't hear this from me. I said, then don't say it. He said, Ryan's broke. I stayed quiet. He continued, job cut, rent late. I said, stop. He asked, does it bother you? I answered, no. At work, Mark said, you're popular lately. I said, how? He said, people talk. I replied, they always do. He leaned back. Emily's name comes up. I said, not my concern. He nodded. Good answer. Lena noticed my mood. You're distracted. I said, I'm informed. She asked, about what? I said, the past knocking. She said, did you open the door? I said, no. She smiled. Proud of you. I passed Sarah at a store. She froze and said, hi. I said, hello. She said, you look well. I said, I am. She hesitated. Emily isn't. I said, I hope she finds stability. Sarah blinked. That's all. I said, that's all. She looked smaller somehow. Later, Daniel called. They fight a lot. I said, please stop. He said, she mentions you. I asked, why? He said, because she remembers. I said, that's her work. He said, you don't want to know more. I said, no. At night, my phone buzzed. One message. Can we talk? My chest tightened. I said out loud, you waited too long. Lena heard my breath change and asked, who is it? I said, a ghost. She said, do you need to answer? I looked at the screen and said, no. I turned it face down. I argued with myself. One conversation could explain everything. Another voice answered, explanations won't heal you. I said, but closure. I stopped. Closure is a myth. The silence after felt earned. Mark asked, you okay? I said, I chose peace. He said, that's power. I didn't smile, but I felt it. Days later, Sarah texted, she's struggling. I typed, I hope she gets support. I deleted it and sent nothing. Lena watched and said, that was hard. I replied, harder to reopen wounds. She nodded. You're protecting yourself. I overheard two coworkers whisper, Ryan can't handle it. The baby's coming. I walked past and said, meeting in 5. They stopped talking. I didn't feel curiosity. I felt distance. Daniel said, she thinks you hate her. I said, I don't. He asked, then what? I answered, I moved on. He sighed. She didn't expect that. I said, neither did I. Lena asked, what do you want now? I said, consistency. She said, you're living it. I agreed. That matters. Another message arrived. Longer this time. I didn't open it. I said, not today. Lena said, maybe never. I said, maybe. The word didn't scare me. Mark clapped my shoulder. You're solid. I said, I learned from cracks. He said, that's how strength forms. I believed him. Sarah called once more. I didn't answer. She texted, she realizes you're gone. I read it and felt nothing sharp. I said to myself, that's the shift. I realized something quietly. I'm not waiting. I said it again. I'm not waiting. The truth settled. Lena smiled at me and said, you're present. I said, I am. She said, that's rare. I replied, it's earned. That night, I deleted the unread messages. I said, memory doesn't need access. I felt lighter. I imagined Emily seeing silence where my replies used to be. I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. I said, I choose this life. Before sleep, I whispered, I was abandoned once. I corrected myself. I was left, and I survived. The difference mattered. I closed my eyes knowing she would finally understand. I wasn't angry. I wasn't waiting. I was already gone. She found me outside the cafe and said, please don't walk away. I stopped. I said, say what you need to say. She looked thinner. Thank you. I didn't invite her to sit. She spoke anyway. I'm tired, she said. I replied, I can see that. She swallowed. I didn't come to fight. I said, good. She said, I came to explain. I answered, I'm listening. She said, I was scared all the time. I said nothing. She continued, I didn't know how to tell you. I stayed quiet. She said, I thought running would be easier. I nodded once. She said, that day, when I called you my husband, I meant it. I lifted my eyes. She rushed on. Or I wanted to mean it. I breathed slowly. She said, I wished I could be that woman. I waited. I was already pregnant, she said. I hated myself for it. I felt the ache but stayed steady. She said, I kept thinking you'd hate me. I replied, I would have been hurt. She flinched. I added, that's different. She said, Ryan isn't what I imagined. I said, that's not my story. She nodded. I know. She wiped her face. I just needed you to know I regret it. I said, regret doesn't change choices. She whispered, I loved you. I said, I believe you did. She looked hopeful. I continued, but love didn't stop you. Her shoulders dropped. She said, I didn't think you'd disappear. I answered, I didn't plan to. She said, I thought you'd fight for me. I replied, I fought for myself. She stared. You didn't even ask why. I said, I already know why. She asked, do you? I said, fear. She said, I ruined everything. I said, you ended us. She winced. I didn't soften it. She said, can you forgive me? I paused. Not today. Tears fell. I didn't reach out. I was so tired of pretending, she said. I answered, so was I. She looked up. Then why can't we try again? I said, because trying again would betray the man I became. She whispered, I miss you. I said, I miss who I was. She asked, was I that bad? I said, you weren't honest. She nodded. I wasn't. She said, I didn't expect silence to hurt this much. I replied, silence is honest. She said, I thought you'd hate me. I said, I don't. She asked, then what do you feel? I answered, acceptance. She cried harder. I don't know how to do this alone. I said, you'll learn. She asked, you won't help me? I said, helping you would hurt me. She closed her eyes. She said, I was wrong. I said, yes. She said, I'm sorry. I replied, I heard you. She asked, is that it? I said, that's it. She looked at me like she was memorizing my face. You're different. I said, I had to be. She said, I don't recognize you. I answered, I finally recognize myself. She reached out and stopped herself. I don't deserve another chance. I said, no. She nodded through tears. Thank you for listening. I said, you're welcome. She asked one last thing. Were we ever real? I answered without hesitation. We were real. We weren't permanent. She closed her eyes and whispered, goodbye. I said, goodbye. I walked away feeling the pain, but it didn't own me. Her tears stayed behind. I didn't carry them. Daniel told me over the phone. Ryan left. I said, okay. He waited for more. He couldn't handle it. I replied, I understand. Daniel said, that's it. I answered, that's it. Later, Sarah messaged, she's alone now. I read it and said out loud, she's not my responsibility. My voice didn't shake. I didn't feel relief. I felt still. Lena noticed and asked, news? I said, old chapters closing. She said, how do you feel? I thought and answered, calm. She nodded. That's growth. At work, Mark said, you here? I said, yes. He asked, angry? I replied, no, he smiled. That's power. I said, it doesn't feel dramatic. He said, the strongest things rarely are. I walk home and talk to myself. You don't need revenge. I answered myself, you never did. I remembered nights wishing for answers and said, you survived without them. Lena said, you're lighter. I said, I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. She said, that takes discipline. I replied, it took pain first. Daniel asked, do you feel bad for her? I said, I feel human. He asked, will you reach out? I answered, no, he nodded slowly. You've changed. I said, I chose to. I heard another update. She asked about you again. I said, I hope she finds peace. The words surprised me with their honesty. I didn't mean reunion. I meant distance without hate. Lena asked, what do you want now? I said, a life I don't need to escape. She smiled. You're building it. One evening, she said, I'm not here to replace anyone. I replied, I know. She added, I'm here to stand next to you. I said, that's enough. We sat in quiet that didn't ache. I caught myself thinking, karma handled it. I said it aloud and laughed softly. I didn't need to destroy anything. The thought felt clean. Mark said, you forgave her? I said, no, he asked, then what? I answered, I forgave myself. He paused. That's harder. I agreed. It was. I remembered blaming myself for signs I missed. I said, you trusted. I answered, that wasn't wrong. Saying it closed something inside me. Lena asked, do you ever feel tempted to look back? I said, sometimes. She asked, what stops you? I replied, respect. She smiled. For yourself. I nodded. Yes. Daniel said, you sound peaceful. I said, I earned it. He laughed. You did. I sat alone one night and said, you didn't lose. The words surprised me. I repeated them. You didn't lose. I felt something loosen. I imagined Emily facing motherhood alone. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel pity. I felt acceptance. I said, this is the result of choices. I included my own. Lena said, you're not rushing. I said, I don't need to. She said, that's rare. I replied, so is surviving betrayal. At work, Mark handed me a new project. You're ready. I said, I am. Responsibility felt steady, not heavy. I said to myself, revenge is loud. I answered, peace is quieter. I chose quiet. I stood in front of the mirror and said, you're not broken. I waited. You're rebuilt. I believed it. Lena asked, what does victory look like to you? I thought and said, waking up without bitterness. She smiled. You're winning. Before sleep, I whispered, I forgive you. I meant myself. My chest eased. I said, I did my best with what I knew. The thought settled. I turned off the light and felt steady. Karma had done its work without my hands. I had done mine without noise. I wasn't triumphant. I was free. I woke up and said, I remember everything. I didn't say it with anger. I said it with clarity. The pain was still there, but it no longer spoke for me. I said, you can exist without control. That felt like truth. Lena asked, how are you today? I answered, awake. She smiled. That's different. I nodded. It is. Daniel called and said, you sound lighter. I replied, I stopped carrying shame. He said, it was never yours. I said, I know that now. I sat alone and spoke honestly. Emily didn't leave because I lacked something. I waited. She left because loyalty scared her. Saying it didn't hurt. It healed. I added, I didn't fail at love. That mattered. Mark said, you look grounded. I said, I reclaimed myself. He nodded. That's the real win. I agreed. I remembered the question that haunted me. Why wasn't I enough? I answered it finally. I was. The echo stayed. I said, I always was. Lena said, you don't talk about her anymore. I said, because she's no longer the center. She replied, and you are. I smiled. Yes. I walked past places filled with memory and felt steady. I said, this city doesn't own my pain. I passed couples laughing and didn't envy them. I said, I will build my own happiness. Daniel asked, do you forgive her? I thought and said, I don't carry resentment. He asked, is that forgiveness? I answered, it's release. He accepted that. I spoke to my reflection. You stayed honest. I added, you stayed kind. My voice didn't break. I said, you survived betrayal without becoming it. That felt like victory. Lena asked, what do you want from the future? I said, consistency. She said, in love. I replied, in myself. She nodded. That's solid. I remembered being called husband and how it once defined me. I said, that title didn't make me. I paused. My character did. The memory lost its sting. Mark said, you don't chase validation. I replied, I don't need it. He smiled. That's rare. I said, it's learned. I thought about Emily without bitterness. I said, she didn't replace me. I repeated it. I was never replaced. The truth settled deep. Lena said, you're choosing slowly. I said, I'm choosing wisely. She replied, that's strength. I believed her. I heard my inner voice clearly now. You are not disposable. I answered, I never was. The old doubt stayed quiet. Daniel joked, so what now? I said, now I live. He laughed. Simple. I said, powerful. I stood in the morning light and said, I claim my dignity. The words felt ceremonial. I added, I claim my future. Nothing argued back. Lena said, you're calm. I said, I'm aligned. She smiled. I like that version of you. I replied, so do I. I thought about justice and realized something important. It didn't come through revenge. I said it again. It came through growth. That was enough. I closed old messages without reading them. I said, the past doesn't get access. My hands were steady. I said, I loved honestly. I added, I was betrayed. I finished, and I healed. Each sentence stood on its own. Before sleep, I whispered, you're awake now. I meant it. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't broken. I was aware. I lay down and felt peace settle without effort. I said, tomorrow belongs to me. The thought didn't frighten me. It excited me. I moved forward quietly, carrying no need to prove anything. I wasn't replaced. I was revealed.